I'm Doug Wright, I'm a playwright, and today I'm driving to meet the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Frank Gilroy, who wrote The Subject Was Roses, Contact with the Enemy, Any Given Day, and a host of other plays. I'm especially excited to meet him because when I was a kid, my mother used to take me to the Dallas Public Library, and I'll never forget at 12 years old pulling The Subject Was Roses off the shelf, sitting on the floor, and reading it cover to cover. In an era of idealized families, it bravely presented families as they really were: contentious, fractious, suffused with pain and with joy, and I saw my own family in it and was profoundly reassured. Frank's plays are in the tradition of great American family dramas, and yet they're suffused with politics. From the agony of World War II to the Civil Rights Movement, he writes about very small, very particular lives caught in the great machinery of history.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Doug. This is my wife, Ruth.
Hi, how
Come
are
on.
you?
Nice to
Very
meet
nice to have you.
Oh,
Yes.
it's thrilling to be here. It's a beautiful house.
Thank you.
Really
Good.
gorgeous.
Uh,
How long have you been here?
50 years.
50 years?
Can you
50 years.
imagine?
Yeah, I know, that's astonishing. How old do you think the house is?
We're not sure about that, but from pictures that have been passed down from one owner to the other, there is on the back of one of them that says, "Grandfather was in the meadow across the way when word came that Lincoln was shot."
Wow.
So we know it goes back that far.
It's really beautiful.
Thank you, thank you. Well, welcome.
This is all the stuff you collect over the years that people give you. I don't even remember what some of them are for. As I said, none of them sustain you. Right.
But nice to have nonetheless. I noticed this rather auspicious
Well,
certificate.
That's because you have one. I don't think one Pulitzer Prize winner has ever interviewed another, and we're separated from age by, what are you, about 50?
Exactly.
I'm 87, so it should be encouraging to know I'm still doing it.
I know, very much so. And a doctorate from
Well, I
Dartmouth.
got a doctorate from Dartmouth.
Yeah.
No one knows how I even got in there, much less get a doctorate.
Well, that was your where you went to undergraduate school, correct?
That's where I went.
And then to go back for an honorary doctorate must have been thrilling.
Well, especially since I only got in there because of the GI Bill.
That's
I was turned down. I applied to 29 colleges after the war. I was turned down by 27.
really.
I have a one-act play about it called Getting In.
And this is your Obie Award for Who'll Save the Plowboy, which
That got me my stripes, whatever.
And was that technically your first full-length play?
The first full-length play I ever got on.
Wow, wow,
Yeah,
that's amazing.
Took
1961.
5 years to get it on. This is a photo I'm very proud of. That's Charlie Branson and his wife Jill Allen, and everybody, whoever directed them, tells bad stories. I have the opposite story. I adapted a novel of mine called From Noon Till 3. Finally, Charlie and Jill did it, and I directed it. And I insisted on rehearsal.
Uh-huh.
He had never rehearsed in his life.
Really?
He came in with smoke coming out of his ears. He said, "What's this rehearsal shit?" I said, "That's the deal I made, Charlie." And little by little, Charlie had never rehearsed. And I treated him seriously.
Uh-huh.
And little by little, and it ended up just being one of the nicest, most harmonious jobs I ever had in my life.
Wow. So as a man of the theater, you knew the value of a good rehearsal.
Well, I was really an actor's director.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know any of the technical stuff.
Uh-huh.
What I learned about actors, I learned from Ulu Grossbard, best man with actors I ever saw. And I learned from him. So I knew how to deal from the theater with talking to actors. But the rest of it, camera, after I did 8 pictures, I knew less afterwards. I just surrendered myself to the technicians.
Uh-huh.
I said, "That's your field. You have a choice. Either give me what I want, give me something better tomorrow night. When I look at the rushes, I know it.
Now, this isn't the room where you traditionally write, correct?
No, would you like to see it?
I'd love to see
All
it.
right. This is where the hard part of my life and your life begins.
Exactly.
This is my workroom now. I started writing on the wall.
Wow, cause and effect, the vital ingredient from tragedy to farce.
Oh, right.
That's amazing. Don't mistake incidents for essence. That's a good one.
First the picture, then the frame.
That's amazing.
Here's the thing, the real key to my life was the GI Bill, which was the best thing the government ever did. Like, I was one of those people. I never would have gone to college or anything if it had not been for the GI Bill, and changed my whole life. I got wise a little bit in the war. I looked around, I thought, who gets killed here? Who gets killed are the young, the ignorant, and the poor. And so I thought there's got to be a better life. So that was my motivation for going to college.
Well, you know, I read that when you got back from the war and knew you wanted to write, you began an all-out search for a royal typewriter.
That's right.
Is this the famed typewriter?
That's the twin.
The twin.
actual is behind, is over there. And my mother found somebody who knew somebody at the Royal Company. It was all very hush-hush because it was black market. This executive came out and he said, that'll be 125, 150. I said, okay, I got it in cash. And he came back and he handed me that typewriter. And I had such a sense of occasion. I said, I'm going to be a writer. He didn't give a shit, like nobody does. But I've been using that and this one now ever since.
And when you famously purchased that beautiful royal typewriter, did you know then that playwriting would be your future?
No, I did not know. I felt, without any real backup, from the time I was 14, I was going to be a writer. The only literature that came into the house pretty much was Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, and what. And they had those short stories. And one day I got an idea, and so I wrote it down. And our only literary connection was my aunt, who worked in the morgue at the World Telegram. So I gave it to my aunt. I said, show it to one of the reporters. She brought it back, and he had written, "The boy shows narrative talent. Tell him to stay away from journalism." I'll jump to the end, like 20 years later. The man who wrote that, whose name was Ed Wallace, and he came to interview me for the World Telegram when I won the Pulitzer Prize.
Is that right?
Yes, but no, plays. I don't come to plays. I'm writing stories until my junior year. And in the summer preceding it, I went to see a movie, The Time of Your Life, and someone had told me that had been a play. And I thought I could do that. So when I went back to Dartmouth, I switched from story writing to playwriting. This gets a little mystical now, and this wonderful old man, Bradley Watson, taught it. And he did something that I recommend to anybody ever teaching playwriting. He said, get a short story that you like and adapt it. I went and I picked the Ring Lardner story, and so help me God, I sat down, time, place, what? And as I was doing that, I thought, I found my thing. If there's anything I can do in a superior way, it's a play. It's plays. My other stuff isn't working like that. And I was hooked for life.
And yet your first real commercial success, am I right, was in television, like Omnibus and Playhouse 90 and Studio One and Kraft.
Well, I had to make a living. And then I went to Yale and left after 8 months, moved back with my parents and assaulted the TV market. And finally started to make my entry a little bit in the so-called golden days of television. But my love was always the theater. Everything was how to get back to the theater. It still is.
And what do you think, if you had to describe the differences in writing for television and writing for the stage, how would you characterize them?
Television in the live days wasn't that different from stage. And there were no series. Everything was an anthology. So you were really writing one-act plays. And they were live, and they were done immediately in New York. So that's different, but it's a better question if you ask me the difference like between screenwriting and it's a completely different talent. I know, you probably know many playwrights who cannot write a screenplay. I know zillions of screenwriters who can't write plays. I consider playwriting the smallest target of all. The smallest, the most difficult of anything. In movies, I can give you a pretty good movie script any day I want to because I can cut here, there, Venice, what? Once the curtain goes up in the theater, there you are. You have the audience for an hour and a half, 2 hours. Your whole case must be made. It's a much, much harder thing. That's why we have many good screenplays. We don't have that many good plays.
So your favorite medium is actually the most rigorous and the most difficult.
Oh, yes. That's my whole life. I had to struggle so hard to make a living in television for the first 7 years. I didn't have time to sit and write a play. Everything was on speculation. There was no writers' guild. There was no union. You had to write like 5 scripts to maybe sell 1. So it was a tough way to make a living. So I couldn't get back to the theater for 7 or 8 years. Yeah.
What's the first play you remember seeing?
The American Way. I can see the set. I think it was Frederick March and his wife. And I don't think the play was a great success. I wouldn't have known if it was or not. But that's my memory.
In your introduction to your first big success, Who'll Save the Plowboy, you describe your process as an intense search for an idea leading to desperation, and then, when I'm near the breaking point, a glimmer of hope. Is it still that way?
It's exactly the same. I mean, I'll ask you as a writer, because I'm curious. I don't get to talk to many writers. Do you have anything that remotely resembles that thing of desperation?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I think I was so moved by the quote, because it synopsized it so eloquently for me. Because I always say to my students when I teach that there's no more potent muse than a good deadline, because suddenly the adrenaline and desperation of knowing you need to fill those pages can unlock parts of your subconscious, and the characters start talking. And it sounds like it's analogous for you.
That's always been in the theater. That's always been my thing. Till you're almost ready to die, and then sometimes they give you something, and by that time you're so alert to a play idea. If it walked 2 miles away, you'd grab it. Right.
Now you mentioned that it was once your great hope that you would be introduced as someone other than the man who wrote the very beloved and well-known play, The Subject Was Roses. So tell me a little bit about the joy and the curse of writing what might be considered your signature play.
If you're not already sharing it, you share a similar problem. Early in your career, you write this wonderful play, I Am My Own Wife. It wins the Pulitzer. That's your signature. Over your life, you'll do things that you love more, that are maybe better or what. You will be hard-pressed to not be introduced for your signature play. It doesn't matter what you do. Now, the thing is, don't complain about it. Because one day, Roses was going to play in St. Louis, and some guy in a newspaper called up to do a newspaper interview, and I happened to say, Jesus, just once, I'd like to have somebody call me about it. And he humbled me. He said, do you realize how lucky you are? Do you realize how many people would die to have what you have? And I said, I take your words to heart. I will never say that again. So I'm telling you.
Good advice.
Yeah. There's one other catch. After I won the Pulitzer, people can say, well, does it change you? And I said, no, I feel the same. Nothing's different. Nothing's different. I didn't realize until years later I wasted 2 years of my life. I let valid ideas go by because they didn't seem worthy of a Pulitzer Prize winner. And that's another big trap. And then finally, then I forced the play and fell on my ass appropriately. And it sort of woke me up. And but You do have the first line of your obituary written. So.
That's always a good thing. So, public acclaim for The Subject Was Roses was enormous, but do you have a play that perhaps you're proudest of regardless of its reception?
Dear, listen, we all get bruised. Sometimes you do bad work correctly, you're blamed. Sometimes you do bad work, you're praised unworthy. Every once in a while you do good work, and it's not rewarded, and those are the ones that really hurt you. And so I did a play some years ago, which is actually a prequel to Roses. It takes place in another place.
Any Given Day, correct?
Any Given Day, yeah. Just a lovely play. Everybody, the actors, everything was great. And we got lovely notices, and what killed us, really, we took a dip at a Saturday matinee, which when we thought no critic will be there. The New York Times critic was there.
Nightmare.
I don't know if it would have made any difference if he'd come a different time, but that was the play that really bruised me a bit.
I do think one of the most challenging aspects of dealing with a public career like ours is the critics and the role they play. How do you, as a writer, either keep them at bay or at least in perspective when you work?
It was fine when I started out. There were 8 newspapers. Everybody came opening night. Everything built to a crescendo. You had 8 different opinions. Then, for the last many years, only the Times critic really matters. No, the other papers are gone. No one listens to television.
Do you read the critics? Do you read them when they
Oh
write
yeah,
about
I
your
know.
work?
I always did. No, man. I wouldn't dwell on them, but I made it a point to read everything that's ever written. Then you look at it, and otherwise it becomes your imagination dwells on. Yeah, and you go on.
Well, it's interesting when I think about your work, Frank. I think about a play like The Subject Was Roses or Any Given Day, where you take some of the raw fodder of your own history and reinvent it as art. And I think of a play like Contact with the Enemy that so movingly dramatizes.
That's a big favorite of mine.
Oh, remarkable play. And I think in each of these plays, as an author, you're witnessing history for us. And it makes me wonder if you have a sense of mission about that as a writer. Is that something you're aware that you're doing?
No, but Contact with the Enemy is a very special case in my life. Towards the end of the war, and the Americans overran the first concentration camp, and it was a place you don't even hear of. It's called Ohrdruf. And the day it was found, Eisenhower and Patton went to see it. And Patton threw up, and Eisenhower said, everybody within the surrounding area who can be spared must come and see this so they know what they're fighting and dying for. So the next day, I was in a mechanized reconnaissance troop attached to an infantry division. It was a beautiful, warm, sort of springish sort of day, and suddenly the lieutenant comes back and says, we're going to go and see something. I never call a concentration camp. No one ever heard of it. We said, what's that? He said, no one knows. So we got up. We were 9 vehicles, 30 guys. But it's very peaceful. It's lovely. Oh, God, it's bringing back all kinds of memories. And we go up into this place, stockade and what? Bodies every place. I often wondered how many bodies were right at my feet, naked, all like little skeletal bodies, bones and what, all dead. A body 50 yards long, 5 bodies high. And a man named John Toland did a book called The Last 100 Days. He was there, and how many bodies were at my feet? Were 3,200. Sort of like the World Trade Center, but they're all naked and they're all... And we're young, we're 19. I mean, nothing, you can't comprehend it. I made up my mind that day that someday I was going to bear witness in some meaningful way. And then years later, as the plays often do, usually when a play falls in place, 2 or 3 things happen that seemed unrelated, and all of a sudden they coalesce. That's what happened with Contact with the Enemy. Suddenly, I had another experience within that same framework, and now I had the play, Contact with the Enemy, and which was a very strange experience in my life because the first 3 producers I showed it to called me within 12 hours. This is fantastic. But the same 3 producers called me next day. It's too strong. Can't do it, because I didn't just take the conventional thing. I broadened it. I involved myself in what I was feeling.
Well, what strikes me as so remarkable from a craft perspective about the play is it's a very simple conceit. It's 2 men who meet visiting that museum, and yet in their discourse and conversation, you get the full moral weight of the war. And that's what I think makes it such an astonishing achievement. And do you think that in order to write about that cataclysmic experience and your witness to it, you needed 40 years to process it so it could arrive so distilled?
I had that information available all the time. It wasn't, as I said, until I suddenly grafted onto it my story within that framework, where I saw I wasn't just the innocent bystander. I had a culpability. We all make it, we say, oh, it's just the Nazis and what. That's too easy.
Absolutely.
That's too easy. There's a bit of, anyway.
The play implicates all of us.
Yes, it does. Anyway. Oh, I got a shiver as I talk to you.
Well, I'm glad, because I was very moved by it. I do want to ask, since you have drawn heavily from your own life, you've written about figures that may have loosely been based on your parents, you've written about your own experience, you've written about army buddies. Has anyone that you've actually written about seen your work, seen themselves represented through your author's imagination, and had a response or taken you to task?
I never would have written Roses if my father was alive. He would have killed me. Roses really never happened, but all the details are right. The Irish side of my family, their only complaint, I think, was that when I spoke of my father's sisters marrying policemen, they never went with anybody less than a sergeant. I mean,
I wanted, you were mentioning earlier when we were chatting this morning about the thrill of watching Ulu Grossbard direct actors like Jack Albertson and Martin Sheen in your work. What is the role of the playwright in rehearsal? What should we be doing when directors are crafting performances and realizing our work? What's our function?
It depends on the writer and the director. Ulu and I worked hand in glove. I was at every rehearsal, available to change anything, whatever like that. So that's how I learned so much about acting. So when I started directing movies, it's all from what I got from watching Ulu, who was just masterful. I haven't found that in every relationship with directors, but Ulu was the epitome, and also the man who directed Plowboy, Dan Petrie. We just worked. It was never ego, never anything. We just did the work, and the director is glad to have the writer there. It's another eye, somebody to talk to. And so I've always been at every rehearsal of a play of mine. You might see this, you might see that. I've never directed one of my own plays. I have no desire. My temperament is not geared to direct a play. I'm geared to direct movies where you make 100 decisions every day, 75 can't be recalled. That's my style. But plays, it's enough just to be the writer.
And yet you've directed your own screenplays, certainly.
Oh, yes, yes, 8 of them.
Wow, and so that, for some reason in that medium, you don't feel daunted by directing your own words.
No, not at all. I can't conceive of anybody else directing my words in a movie.
You've worked with some of the most estimable actors that we've known in our field, from Seda Thompson in your play Any Given Day to the legendary screen siren Elizabeth Taylor. And it leads me to ask if you've ever written for specific actors as you create characters, or if you've ever collaborated intensively with an actor as you wrote a role.
The way we used to do it, my wife, she'd say, we're getting broke. You better grab something on TV. She no sooner said this one day than the phone rang, and I picked it up, and he said, Frank Gilroy? I said, yeah. I said, who's this? He said, Jackie Gleason. So I have a friend who does voices. I said, come on, Marty. He said, no, the roly-poly guy. I said, it's straight, it's you. He said, yeah. He said, I made up a story. I told it to Studio One. I wanted somebody to write it. They said I should call you. Oh, I said, here I am. Come on in, have breakfast with me tomorrow. We'll wrap it up. So I drive into his penthouse and we have breakfast. And that's a case I had the luxury of writing for Jackie. And the review said he triumphed over the material.
Those years of working in television, though, the ability to turn around material so quickly and to know that in a week's time it was going to be fully realized and broadcast, that must have, the lessons learned there must have held you in good stead when you got into the theater.
Well, as I said, when it was live, no series. It was like anthology, all just one-act plays. There were no rating systems. So the producers, who weren't the dumbest people in the world or ran the networks, they pleased themselves. That's why television was much more intelligent in those days. Once they got into rating systems, and then series, and then everything moved out to L.A., which I had to then follow to make a living. It was very exciting. Your thing would go on, you'd write it, be on Monday, everybody be talking about it like it was a little play in New York. And it was very, very exciting. I mean, just thinking of some of the people, I wrote for Jimmy Cagney, who was in The Time of Your Life, was called in, a picture called The Gallant Hours, based on the life of Admiral Bill Halsey, Robert Montgomery directing. And they were in their second week of shooting, and they weren't happy. My agent called me, and he said, they want you to write behind the camera, which is the most power any writer has ever had. Montgomery had a reputation of being quite right-wing, and I'm liberal, and I thought, well, I wonder how. I said, screw it, I'll do it. Great job. I go in, I meet Cagney, and what they want me to do is liven up the material. And Montgomery was a dream, and I worked out a thing. It's better to work for Republicans than liberals in the movies, because the Republicans have the money in the bank, the liberals don't, and they kill you trying to get it.
I believe you. So it's funny to hear you talk, Frank, because playwriting is also my passion, and my first fidelity is to the theater. But like you, I have earned a living and paid my mortgage writing TV and film.
Right.
And hearing you talk makes me feel like it's ever been thus. How do you think playwriting has changed over the years? Do you think most writers are still required to write for all media in order to make a living?
I think much more so. I think, and it used to be, if you had a hit play, you could almost retire for life. I mean, things don't go. I mean, when Roses went, we ran for 2 years. That's unheard of. And road companies and everything like that. Today, plays come and go. They don't. The audience is watching a lot of television, interesting stuff. They're watching movies. They're watching this and that. So I think it's very hard to make a living. So I did like you. It's like being a junkie. I subsidized my habit.
Well, tell me if this is my own vanity,
Right.
and if you need to knock me down a peg, do.
Right.
But sometimes I feel like the great thing about being a playwright is even though you don't make the money, and even though you make a million sacrifices to do it, your work exists in two places. It exists on the stage, and it exists on the bookshelf. And that makes you a literary person in a way that film and television scripts, as gorgeously crafted as they may be and as brilliantly written, will never achieve the same patina as literature. Do you agree, or am I being too high-minded?
But you're a fellow junkie. I mean, it's like two of us talking about it.
Or fix.
And I get the same good feeling knowing that, particularly if it's published, and I mean, what is Roses now, 40 years old, and some of my others, and it's done quite continuously. I love hearing about places where it's done. It gives you a feeling of some permanence, something that you don't get. Movies come, go, what matter?
Well, and just to illustrate your point about Roses, it opened 40 years ago with Martin Sheen playing the son,
Right.
and recently Martin Sheen played the father.
And it was Marty's idea to play the father of the son he used to be. So I flew out. My whole family it was a wonderful experience. And Marty, He was just absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
And it illustrates, too, the living nature of the theater, that your play can
That's
be
right.
reinvented by subsequent generations.
That's right.
It's a living document.
Right.
You talk about it with so much passion. If it's not what you did, is there anything else in the world you can imagine that Frank Gilroy would have pursued or would have done?
Yes, it's a very strange thing. If I hadn't become a writer, I would have been a professional gambler. My game was crap shooting, and I did handsomely on the ship going over, and while I was overseas, at some point I sent home so much money, my father sent back a message, "I don't know what you're doing, but stop." But that's only dollar gambling. What's more important, every player, anybody who decides to be a writer and does it, that's real gambling. I then went one extra step and made independent movies. I made 4. I raised the money and everything, would mortgage my house sometimes. That's gambling. That's all the action I ever needed. The other thing is just a distant memory.
Now, when you showed me your workroom upstairs, you suggested that it's where we face everything difficult. It's the hardest part of our lives.
That's true.
What is the hardest part of writing for you?
The in-between, when you don't have an idea. If you have an idea and you're working, that's great, and you can't really force them. It's like having a factory that's all geared to go, but if you don't have the material, that's why we have so very few plays. We got lots of writers who have proven they know how to write a play. But unless you get an idea that fills the requirements that no one's able to define of a play, you're lost. You're the same writer and then all of a sudden, I'm having an experience as we're talking. It's very strange at my age. I should be just taking bows now. But no, it'll never leave you. That's the curse of being a writer. As long as you can draw a breath, you can write. And that's also the bad side.
Do you have any cures for writer's block? Do you have, on those days when you know you should be writing, do you force it or do you let the day go? What's the healthier response?
I have something else going for me. I'm in the 50th year of keeping a daily journal. 50 years. You're all going to be in it tomorrow. So, and I've been doing that for 50 years. But that's only that's so automatic. That puts a platform under my day. It's how my day begins. But then I'm always fooling with something else. I've got all kinds of projects now. I've gotten very lazy about production. Part of it was this thing of, particularly plays, of doing a play and then only one person can pass life or death judgment. And I thought, I don't need it. If these things are worthwhile, they can be done after I die. But then one of my sons, my eldest son, said to me one day, he said, "Look, let's talk." He said, "You're piling up all this stuff." He said, "You're going to pass on." He said, "I can't spend half my life producing your shit," he said. and he's right. So I'm starting to put things back in the water again. And then the other thing I've got going is Kindle singles. I don't know if you're into any of that stuff.
No, absolutely. And I just have to say that it stuns and delights me that you are writing for the most modern of all forms, the ebook, on that old Royal typewriter. It's incredible to me.
You're right.
In terms of writing itself, sometimes I dispirit actors and directors a little bit because they say, what's the best thing about writing a play? And what they want to hear is, well, sitting in rehearsal, the moment when you unlocked that impossible scene. And the deep, dark secret I carry is the best part of writing a play is when you're alone by yourself at that Royal typewriter and a character says something that floors you.
That's right.
Isn't that the best part of what we do?
What sustains you is the process. They enjoy the process of writing. And sometimes just going and working on something. Some of them maybe no chance. It could be a movie script or a play. The process gives you the feeling of doing something you enjoy. But that is right. When you're in that cocoon, it's just you and the paper, and things are working. And they're working sometimes so well you can't think, I'm not writing this. I'm being used by some other power. Have you? I'm sure you've had that
Oh,
feeling.
yeah. The
That's
characters are talking to you and you're just transcribing.
I know.
Yeah.
It's spooky.
Uh-huh.
It's spooky. When it goes well, you don't seem to be able to take credit for it.
It's funny, I mentioned to your wife, Ruth, that you've chronicled some of the most unhappy and tortured and entertaining marriages that I think the theater has seen, and yet your own seems very, very happy indeed. Is that because you learned what not to do in your writing?
No, I'm going to tell you. First of all, you got to be very lucky. Then the other thing, a short answer I always say is, what you don't realize, there have been 3 divorces that no one noticed. I mean, there are difficulties and rough things and what. And what it goes back to is, just like plays go back to the moment of conception, which you never triumph. If it's the conception's off, you can work forever. Same thing with marriages. You got to know each other. You got to live with each other. You got to find out that you have some deep thing. I mean, Ruth is the best editor and what that I know. And we met when I hadn't even yet cracked television.
Wow.
We never had a safety net. We had no alternative. We just had to make it. And she was working. She supported us. She worked as a secretary. And she's a sculptress who has never sounded the full depths of her talent.
Are there particular writers whose work has especially impacted on you or inspired yours?
Above all, Chekhov. He was what I aspired to. That's where I got the greatest respect. Then there are individual plays rather than particular writers. I always thought that if Beckett didn't write Waiting for Godot, I would have written it 5 years later. I think every writer feels like it's right there. Why didn't we do it?
It's interesting. I can see the Chekhov connection because when I think about your work, Frank, I think of very intimately drawn domestic drama that is personal, immediate, and yet in the journeys of your characters, we see major social and historical forces at work, like World War II and sometimes in Last Licks, infidelity and the specter of the concentration camps. So I see what I can identify as a consistent Frank Gilroy style. Do you see that in your own work, or is it outside you?
No, I worked out a long time ago. Once you become aware of a style, that's very bad. I always felt that style should be the part of yourself that you repeat unconsciously. And if you ever become conscious that you have a style that you're trying to... No, it never enters my mind. Each project is separate. No, I'm not aware of that at all. I know that I'm concise, sometimes overly concise. I'm a storyteller. I'm an Irish storyteller. When I was 14, how I felt I was going to be a writer was that I loved telling stories.
You said that you write with economy, and I learned so much reading your dialogue, Frank, because it is so terse, but at the same time contains so much meaning.
Something you're not telling me.
We all have our little secrets.
There is something.
Take you and your money, for instance.
I want to know what it is.
For all I know, we're millionaires.
I want to know why she walked out.
Just between us chickens, how much do you have?
Answer me.
So you're able to write in a way that's condensed, but always real and always emotionally full. Do you overwrite initially and pare back, or does dialogue come to you that cleanly?
I'm not one of those writers that does a lavish first draft and cuts back. I pretty much go step by step. I want everything. I may change it all later on, but I got to feel secure as I'm going.
Now, I know that in addition to your writing career, you've done remarkable service on behalf of writers because you're both a former president of the Dramatists Guild.
Right.
You were part of the landmark writers' strike in the early 1960s that brought about so many crucial reforms for screenwriters and TV writers.
I mean, that was some experience. The writers had nothing then. We didn't have any royalties. Everything was on spec. We didn't have anything. They were treated like dirt. And suddenly they got it together out there. I remember I was working at MGM, and bingo, the job stopped. And everybody thought, oh, this will be over in a couple of weeks. It went on for exactly 4 months. And we had been saving enough money to come back east. We were wiped out. We had to stay another 2 or 3 years to get back. And but that's also when I wrote Roses. During the Writers Guild strike, I had the time. Once we got the Writers Guild, we got respect, and we got royalties, residuals, no more of this going in and giving everything away. So I'm a very strong union guy, and very strong for the Dramatists Guild. Anything that, let's face it, writers are among the best people in the world. Why shouldn't we run it?
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. So my partner, I call him my husband in some states, knows I have a sweet tooth. And so he said that my gravestone should read, "Wake me up when there's pie." Let's hope that it's not for many, many years, but if you had to compose your own epitaph, and let's presume it's not the author of the subject was Roses, what would it be?
Well, actually, in a book I wrote called Writing for Love, at the very end, it was on somebody's tombstone. The gist of it is, give me work for the end of my life and give me time to do it. Something like, that's what I asked for, work to the end of my life. I have no complaints. I have any time that I'm tempted to feel sorry for myself or what, I have a mantra. And what I say is, Donovan, Sailor, Kavanaugh. And those are the 3 boys in my platoon who were 19, same age as me, who got killed.
Wow, wow.
And any time I think of all the years of life that I've had, and they're still frozen in my mind at 19. I don't even know where they're buried. I don't even know. Every once in a while I think I should try to find, what good would that do? Anyway, that's my mantra. The rest of my life, after that experience, and it was only 2 months, I was only in combat, and in those 2 months, out of the 30 guys in my platoon, 3 were killed, 4 or 5 were wounded, and 2 cracked up. So that's a lot for 2 months. But it keeps my feet level. I have no right to ever really feel down, or it's all been a bonus.
So, Frank, you mentioned that the good news and the bad news was, as writers, we never retire.
That's true. My day starts with putting an entry in my journal, which I've been doing for 50 years, but then I'm always on the prowl. My journal is so natural to me. I can't imagine going into the day. It's like breathing. I started it by accident, and I took on a life of its own, and it's a true journal.
I find it, as a writer, slightly your junior, not that many years, but slightly.
Quite a few years.
Well, when you suggest a writer's life, you are as on fire as you can be based on your current project, that you're still hungry, you know there's more to accomplish, and that every day is waking up ready to ferret out the next opportunity, and that never changes. You still feel that way.
Yeah, it never changes. You always think that it's what keeps you going. But I'm really surprised now that I'm into something in a way I never thought I would be again. I mean, one-act plays, I've done a lot of one-act plays, thanks to the Ensemble Studio Theater, and I have all kinds of things that I've never even put out in the world. I don't know. I've been sort of lazy, but I'm trying to get back to it now. It was easier for me to write than to seek production. I say, oh, well, I'll get to that the next time, and one like that, yeah.
And so you mentioned you have grandchildren that are interested
Yeah.
in pursuing acting careers. What advice would you have for anyone maniac enough to want to pursue our rather antique profession of the theater?
Don't.
Don't.
No, try it, and don't delude yourself. I know at my age, contemporaries, people who were given praise about their work in college by people who are really not entitled to give praise and are still pursuing something which stopped them from having full careers in other things, still chasing this. I know somebody's been working on a novel for 70 years, for God's sake. I'm very leery about false praise. And what? I'd rather err on the side of being overly severe than to give false praise. I fear that more than anything. I've seen more lives hurt by it. If you want to know if you're a writer, the best thing is you write and then get friends in. Have somebody read your work aloud. There's nothing that teaches you like hearing your own dialogue spoken. You can't hide from the truth. If it's bombing, it's bombing.
So, Frank, twice in your body of work, you've returned to the story of the same family. The first play the subject was roses. Then you followed that up with a kind of prequel called Any Given Day. Will that family be returning?
Yes, yeah. I have a play called Closing Arguments. And it takes place like 15 or 20 years after Roses. It takes place in my grandmother's home. And the final real harsh truths of this family, everything is finally said. I knew for years that my aunt, who had been an opera singer, I knew she and my father had an affair for a long time. I knew that. And she went to her grave without ever knowing that I knew that. And I didn't have any, I really supported them and everything. And how we get to all of that, she and I confronted finally. That's part of that play. And the final things are said there that, but I never could say it when she was alive. She would have died if she had no idea that I knew. My job always was, from the time I was an only child, I had a brother who lived 3 days, younger brother, but I kept the family together. It was a strange thing to have this feeling of keeping my parents together. I always felt like carry these enormous weights. That's why I love the Army.
You got away.
It really was. I was a sickly child. I was so sickly they didn't think, Dr. Goldberg didn't think they'd take me in the Army. And from the day I got in the Army, I was never sick a day. I had gotten away from a very unhappy home life that I thought everybody's life is like this. And I was never sick a day after that. That's all covered in Roses. But this thing I clung to, and finally I got it said.
Well, it makes sense that you'd feel such simpatico feeling toward a play like Long Day's Journey into Night, because the same way O'Neill wrote that as a kind of exorcism of his family to give him closure in those relationships that life denied him. It sounds like in Roses, in Any Given Day, and in Closing Arguments, you've been able to do the same thing.
Yeah, that's right. I know I had to get that done to go to my grave with somebody. I had to get Contact with the Enemy done. I had to get the Three Roses plays done.
Somebody said that writing is when you have stories so large inside you that they can't be contained any longer and they can't be kept secret any longer.
Right.
And your remarks make me think of that.
Yeah. There's a lot to be said for longevity. No, actually, there is not a lot to be said. This is only one of the good things about it. I can't think of many other good things to be said about longevity, except if it gives you a chance to do things you hadn't done before, or to say things, Robert Frost's phrase, Earth is the proper place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better. So you better say those things now. Don't save him.
Well, I do have my own pet theory, Frank, that as writers, when the very, very personal, whether it comes from our subconscious or our family lives or the pain we've weathered as fathers or sons or daughters or mothers, and the political, the large events we can't control, like warfare, when the personal and the political intersect and offer meaning together that's inseparable, that's when art happens. And I see that in your work
Well,
again
thank
and
you. I
again.
appreciate it.
And I think that's why it's so moving. I think that's why it's enduring. And I think that's why when and if you pass from this earth, which I hope isn't for many, many years, and they unearth all those boxes of plays you haven't shared with us yet, I have a hunch there'll be some real jewels.
All right, I really appreciate that.